I have known Caspian Aldrit, the Duke of Barrowmere, for 22 years, and I can tell you with certainty that he is not a man who crosses rooms. He does not move toward people. People move toward him, and they do so carefully with considered words and careful smiles, because a duke of his particular reputation, feared in Parliament, colder than a January bench, possessed of an absolute sense of what is right and what is not, does not receive a misjudged approach with patience. I was his closest friend, and I moved toward him only when he asked me to. Everyone else in England had learned to wait. Which is why, when I watched him cross the full length of the Kelmere ballroom in November of 1823, I set down my glass and did not pick it up again for a very long time. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me begin where it began, not with Caspian moving, but with a young woman standing perfectly still at the edge of a room, and with the particular quality of her stillness, which was the stillness not of peace, but of practice. Her name was Emmeline Voss, though I did not know it that first evening. I doubt many people in that ballroom knew it, because Emmeline Voss had not been to a ball, a dinner, a garden party, a concert, or any other gathering of polite society in 3 years. 3 years. She had been 21 when she was last seen in public, a quiet girl at her father's elbow, pretty in an undemonstrative way, possessed of very good manners and a mother who had died when she was 12. Her father had remarried. Her father had then, some 18 months after the remarriage, inconveniently died himself. What followed is not unusual in the telling, though it is wretched in the living. The second Mrs. Voss, Henrietta, she called herself, though I found the name too soft for the woman who wore it, had 2 daughters of her own. They were not without advantages. They were handsome enough, with the kind of handsome that announces itself before it enters a room, and they were loud with it and ambitious and determined to be noticed first. Emmeline was not without advantages either, but hers were quieter. A generous intelligence, a composed face, an ability to listen and respond that made people feel somehow that they had been understood. These are not small things, but they are not loud things either, and Henrietta Voss had made a calculation. 2 daughters, 1 drawing room, a moderate estate with a single season's worth of budget for presentation. Emmeline's name on a guest list at any dinner in the county meant a 3rd face at the table, a 3rd gown to be considered, a 3rd young woman drawing the attention of any eligible gentleman who might otherwise be looking at Georgiana or Philippa. So the calculation was made. It was made quietly and with the particular cruelty of things that are never said aloud. Emmeline was not banished. She was not locked in an attic. She was simply necessary elsewhere. There was always something, a letter to be copied, a household account to reconcile, a headache that required her to rest. The grounds of Ashford Grange were lovely in the autumn. Perhaps she preferred the quiet. 3 years passed. 2 seasons came and went for Georgiana and Philippa, and with them 2 respectable, if unexciting, engagements, and the county gradually forgot that Emmeline Voss existed. The invitation to Kelmere House arrived in October, addressed to the Voss family. Henrietta read it twice. Kelmere was Lord Penwick's estate, and the ball was the grandest of the autumn. 3 counties converged on it, and a duke would be in attendance. The Aldrit name was there on the host's guest list, the Duke of Barrowmere, and Henrietta was not foolish enough to think that leaving one of her daughters at home when a duke might be in the room was anything other than carelessness. But Georgiana and Philippa were engaged. Their business was finished. And Henrietta had a daughter, a stepdaughter, technically, who was 24 years old and had not been seen in public since she was 21, and whose name was still, technically, on the invitation. Emmeline was told on Thursday. The ball was on Saturday. She was given a gown that had belonged to Georgiana the previous spring, white silk gone slightly yellow at the hem, taken in at the waist, and let out at the shoulders with the particular improvisation of someone who means the alteration to hold for 1 evening and nothing longer. She was given no maid, no proper gloves. She used her own white cotton that had seen better winters. And she was not spoken to in the carriage beyond Henrietta's observation that she was to keep quiet, not to interrupt, and to remember that any gentleman who spoke to her that evening would be doing so out of courtesy rather than genuine interest. Emmeline said nothing to this. She was very good, I would learn, at saying nothing. It was one of the qualities that had kept her whole. I noticed her before Caspian did. I was standing near the door to the east corridor when the Voss party arrived, and I watched Henrietta sail into the room with the confidence of a woman who has been to many balls, and I watched 2 pretty enough young women follow her, the engaged daughters, both wearing their rings quite visibly. And then I watched a 3rd young woman step through the doorway alone, with no one to introduce her and no one waiting to receive her. And she looked at the room the way you look at a room when you have not been in a room like this for 3 years. Carefully, very carefully, as though she is recalibrating, taking her bearings, finding the walls. She moved to the edge of the floor. She did not look lost. She looked like a woman who has decided that the edge of the floor is where she has been placed, and who has therefore made the edge of the floor her own, with her back straight and her hands folded, and her expression the kind of composed that has nothing to do with indifference and everything to do with discipline. I remember thinking, whoever that young woman is, she has been through something. I did not have time to wonder further, because Caspian appeared at my elbow. "Fetch," he said, which was his way of announcing himself. "Barrowmere," I said, which was mine. We stood together in the comfortable silence that is the privilege of a 22-year friendship, and I watched Caspian's eyes move across the room with the particular economy of a man who does not waste attention. He catalogued the room the way he always did, Lord Penwick at the center, the usual figures, the usual arrangements, and then his eyes reached the east wall and they stopped. I looked at him. He was looking at the edge of the floor. "Who is that?" he said. "I don't know," I said. "She came in with the Voss party. Stepdaughter, I think she was on her own." He said nothing else. He simply looked, with an expression I had seen on Caspian Aldrich's face perhaps 4 times in 22 years, an expression that had nothing to do with the usual Ducal calculation, and everything to do with something considerably more immediate. I picked up my glass and thought, well, he did not approach her that evening. Caspian had a code, and the code said that a young woman who has been deposited at the edge of a ballroom without introduction is not in a position to receive a duke without discomfort, and that discomfort is not a foundation he is interested in. He watched her quietly, and he asked Penwick quietly, and by the end of the evening he knew her name, her situation in general terms, and that she had not danced once because no one had asked her and her stepmother had not thought to facilitate an introduction. He came to me in the carriage home. "The Voss stepdaughter," he said. "I know," I said. "She hasn't been out in 3 years." I gathered. "That woman," he said, and by that woman he meant Henrietta, and his voice had a quality it gets when his sense of what is right has been offended, brought her out as an afterthought. "Yes," I said. He looked out the window for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to call at Ashford Grange." I said, "Caspian, the stepmother will misinterpret that." "The stepmother," he said, "may misinterpret whatever she likes." He called at Ashford Grange on the following Wednesday, and I know what happened because he told me afterward in the clipped, careful way he had of telling me things that mattered to him, which was to say he told me very little, and I understood a great deal. Henrietta had received him in the drawing-room. She had sent for Emmeline, not, Caspian suspected, out of any decency, but because a duke in the drawing-room called for every available young woman, and Henrietta had, in that moment, recalculated. Emmeline came in. She had not known he was there. She stepped into the room and saw him standing, and there was a moment, Caspian said it was very brief, half a breath, in which something showed in her face that was not composure. Something that looked like surprise, and then underneath the surprise, something careful and braced. She had learned, he thought, not to trust pleasant surprises. He made conversation. He was not a man of idle conversation, but he managed it because she was worth managing it for. She was thoughtful. She answered him with a precision that suggested she had spent a great deal of time thinking carefully about things and very little time saying them aloud. When he asked her about the grounds, they were visible from the window, and it was the kind of question that allows a person to say as much or as little as they choose. She looked at the window for a moment, and then she said, quietly, "I know them very well. I have had a good deal of time to know them." He said it was the most understated sentence he had heard in his life. He came again the following week, and the week after. Henrietta managed the visits with tremendous industry, positioning Georgiana and Philippa at Emmeline's flanks, steering conversation, redirecting his attention with the practiced smoothness of a woman who had been doing this for years. She was not stupid, Henrietta. She understood that a duke calling 3 times on a household means a duke with a purpose, and she had daughters who were already engaged and a stepdaughter whose usefulness she had not, until this moment, fully calculated. But Caspian Aldrich had not become the most feared man in 3 counties by allowing himself to be steered. He found ways to speak with Emmeline. He discovered that she had an excellent memory, a precise and unsentimental humor that she deployed so quietly you might miss it, and a habit of looking directly at a person when they spoke that made you feel, as I said, that you had been genuinely understood. He discovered that she had spent 3 years reading, mostly. The library at Ashford Grange was good, and the library had been her primary occupation since society had ceased to be an option. She knew a great deal about a great many things, and had no particular audience for any of it. He discovered, on his 5th visit, that she was not permitted to walk in the grounds when he called. He discovered this because he asked if he might see the rose garden she had mentioned, and Henrietta said pleasantly that the garden was not at its best this time of year, and Emmeline said nothing, but her hands, which were in her lap, were very still in a way that was not, he thought, natural stillness. He left that afternoon earlier than he had intended, and he came to me that evening. 3 years, he said. Yes, I said. She is not permitted to walk in her own garden when I visit. No, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Fetch, he said. How much do you know about the terms of the Voss will? I looked at him. A reasonable amount, I said. Why? Because, he said, I intend to know all of it by morning. I will not detail what Caspian learned, because it is Emmeline's history and not mine to tell beyond what is necessary. What is necessary is this. Her father's estate had passed, in the absence of a son, under terms that left Henrietta as trustee until Emmeline's marriage, at which point a portion was due to Emmeline directly. Henrietta had known this. 3 years without a season was not, therefore, merely a calculation about competition at the dinner table. It was the extension of control. An unmarried Emmeline was a tractable Emmeline, and a tractable Emmeline was useful, and a useful Emmeline was one who sat in the library and copied letters and did not ask questions about the estate accounts. Caspian read the terms of the will and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "There is another ball at Kelmere. Penwick has just written me it's in 3 weeks. He asks if I will attend." "I know," I said. "I had the same letter." "I want you there," he said. "Caspian," I said carefully, "what are you planning?" He looked at me with the level, undeviating look I had known for 22 years. The look that said the decision was made, and the only variable was the execution. "I am planning," he said, "to say what I mean in a room full of witnesses." I worried about Emmeline in those 3 weeks. Not about Caspian. I knew what Caspian intended, and I knew he would not flinch from it. I worried about her. She had been quiet and braced for 3 years, and the world had given her no reason to believe that pleasantness would last. I had seen her, on Caspian's last visit, watch him say goodbye to Henrietta with a civil warmth that cost him nothing, and I had seen her expression when he turned from Henrietta to her, the careful quality of it, the small brace of a woman who expects the warmth to be performance, and who is always a little waiting to be proved right. She did not know what was coming. I was fairly sure of that. Henrietta brought her to the 2nd Kelmere ball. She brought her because the Duke of Barrowmere had called on Ashford Grange 6 times in 6 weeks, and there was a calculation to be made about visibility, and the calculation said, "Bring the girl, keep her near the daughters, and see what a duke in an open ballroom actually does when he is not being managed in a drawing room." Emmeline wore her own gown this time. I noticed it immediately. It was simpler than anything else in the room, blue-gray silk, high-necked, without ornamentation, and it fit her properly because it was hers, and she wore it with the same composed straightness she wore everything. She was placed again near the edge of the room, but this time she did not look as though she was recalibrating. She looked as though she was waiting, not hopefully. Just waiting, in the way that has become a habit. Caspian arrived late, which was unlike him. I had spoken with him that morning, and he had said only, "I want the room settled when I come in." He understood about rooms. He understood that a man of his presence and reputation entering before the evening has found its rhythm creates a different effect than entering when everyone has already settled into their conversation and their dancing and their small social projects, and has stopped watching the door. He came in at 9:30. I was with him, a step behind. The room noticed, as it always did, a murmur, a turning of heads, the particular recalibration of a gathering that has just registered the arrival of the most powerful man in it. Penwick came to receive him, and there was an exchange of pleasantries, and Caspian handled them with his usual economy and his usual self-possession. And then, when Penwick had moved on, he turned to me. "Where is she?" he said. "East Wall," I said. "Same place." He nodded once. Then he crossed the room. I have told you that Caspian Aldrit does not cross rooms, and I will tell you now what it looked like when he did. It looked very simple from the outside. He simply walked. He walked directly and without deviation through the center of the Kelmere ballroom, and the people in his path moved, not because he asked them to, but because something in his bearing made it clear that he knew exactly where he was going and would arrive there regardless. The dancing did not stop, but the conversations near him did, in a ripple outward from his path, and there was a particular silence that opened up around him as he moved, the silence of a room collectively understanding that something is happening. He arrived at the east wall. He arrived at Emmeline. She had seen him coming. I watched her see him coming, the moment her eyes found him at the center of the room, the careful composure, and then beneath it, the thing she could not quite suppress, which was not hope exactly, but was the thing that lives just below where hope has been taught not to go. He stopped in front of her, and then, and I have thought about this many times in the years since because it is the detail that stays with me, he did not bow. He was a duke. He did not owe a bow to anyone in that room except perhaps the king himself. But he looked at Emmeline Voss and he inclined his head, the way you incline your head to someone you genuinely respect. And then he said, in a voice that was quiet enough that only she could hear him and the people immediately surrounding her, "Miss Voss." "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was perfectly steady, but her hands at her sides were pressed flat against her skirts, and I knew what that cost her. "I have something to say to you," he said, "and I wish to say it clearly. I am aware that this is a room with a good deal of witnesses. I would have you know that is deliberate on my part." She looked at him, she waited. "I have called on you 6 times, he said. "I am aware that those calls have been managed. I am choosing not to let them be managed this evening." A brief pause, and in the pause I saw something shift behind his eyes, the thing that is always behind Caspian's deliberate sentences. "You are the most perceptive woman I have met in a great many years. You have a quality of attention that is rare. You have been ill-used and quietly, and I find that I am not able to leave this room without saying so." He stopped. Then he said, "I would like your permission to speak to you properly, without an audience on your stepmother's side of the conversation." There was a silence. The room, in its peripheral and sideways way, had been listening, not obviously, but the way ballrooms listen, the turning of a shoulder, the pause in a sip of wine, the slight angle of a head. Emmeline was aware of it. I could see that she was aware of it, and I could see something else, the moment the brace relaxed. The smallest release, the weight of 3 years of careful holding. "I would like that," she said, "very much." He offered her his arm. She took it, and the room moved. Not dramatically, not with the gasps of a stage performance, but in the quiet, seismic way of a roomful of people who have just understood something and are rearranging themselves accordingly. Heads turned. Whispers began. And across the floor, Henrietta Voss stood with her glass halfway to her lips, and she watched the Duke of Barrowmere walk the length of the Kelmere ballroom with her stepdaughter on his arm. And something passed over her face that I will confess I found, in that moment, entirely satisfying. Caspian did not look at Henrietta, not once. He had no interest in the vanquishing. He had interest only in the woman beside him. They were on the terrace for nearly an hour. I stood inside, near the door, in the way that old friends stand near doors, not quite guarding, not quite not. Penwick found me at some point and gave me a look of considerable amusement, and I returned it in kind, and we did not discuss what was happening on the terrace because there was not much to discuss. Caspian had made his position very clear. When they came in, Emmeline's expression was different. It was still composed. She was always composed. But the quality of the composure had changed. It was the composure of a woman who is standing on solid ground for the first time in a long time, and who is allowing herself, cautiously, to stand on it. He danced with her. He did not dance with anyone else. Henrietta made 2 attempts before the evening ended to insert herself. The first was an approach with both daughters in tow, a social sortie dressed as coincidence. Caspian received it with the impeccable cold courtesy that was his birthright, answered every pleasantry Henrietta offered, and then, with an efficiency that I found genuinely impressive, turned the conversation back to Emmeline and left Henrietta holding a glass of champagne and nothing else. The second attempt was a quiet word to Emmeline on her way to the retiring room. I did not hear it, but I saw Emmeline's face when she came out. And I saw Caspian look at her face and understand it without a word being said, and I saw his jaw set. He spoke to her for 10 minutes on the way to the carriage. I do not know precisely what was said. What I know is that Emmeline returned to Ashford Grange that night, and the following morning she received a note from Caspian, and the morning after that he arrived at Ashford Grange with his solicitor. Henrietta received them in the drawing-room, and this time Emmeline was not called for. This time the meeting was between a Duke's solicitor and Henrietta Voss's solicitor, and the meeting concerned the terms of the Voss will, and the meeting lasted 45 minutes, and when it concluded Caspian came out of the drawing-room and went directly up the stairs, which was not done by any convention, and knocked on the door that his solicitor had told him was Emmeline's. She opened it. "The terms are settled," he said. "Your portion of the estate will be transferred within the fortnight. You are not required to remain here. I have spoken with Penwick, and his wife has a house in the village that is available if you wish it, while the arrangements are completed." She looked at him for a moment. "You did all of that," she said carefully, "without asking me first." He paused. "I did," he said. "I should have asked you first. I apologize." She looked at him for another long moment. And then, and it was the first time I heard about it, he told me later, with a kind of wondering quality to his voice I had never heard in 22 years, she said, "I accept the apology, and yes, I would like the house in the village very much." She left Ashford Grange that afternoon with her own things, and she did not return. They were married in the spring at Barrowmere, in the chapel on the estate, small and candlelit, and full of the smell of beeswax and early flowers coming through the windows. I stood with Caspian at the front, and I watched Emmeline come in on the arm of Lord Penwick, who had been kind enough to offer, and she was in white with her hair arranged simply, and she looked like a woman who had stopped bracing. I had known Caspian Aldrich for 22 years. I had seen him in Parliament, in winter campaigns, in drawing rooms with men who were trying to undo him and board rooms with men who were trying to use him. I had seen him cold and deliberate and correct, and occasionally, with me, something close to warm. I had never, in 22 years, seen his face do what it did when he watched Emmeline Voss walk toward him down the aisle of his own chapel. Afterward, on the step outside in the spring afternoon, he said to me, "Fetch." "Barrowmere," I said. "Thank you," he said, "for standing there." "There is nowhere," I said. "I would have rather been." He looked out at the grounds for a moment, the Barrowmere grounds, which were extensive and beautiful, and which would now belong, in all the ways that mattered, to a woman who knew what it was to be confined to a set of grounds and to love them anyway, and to find another set waiting for her at the end of it. Then he turned back and went inside, because Emmeline was inside, and that, for Caspian Aldrich, had become the only compass point that mattered. I picked up my glass, which someone had handed me at some point in the afternoon, and this time I drank it. She came to know Barrowmere the way she had come to know the grounds at Ashford Grange, thoroughly, precisely, with that quality of attention she brought to everything. The gardens, the tenants, the library, which was considerably larger than the one she had spent 3 years reading through, and which she made very clear she intended to finish. She took on the household with the same competence she had applied, quietly and without credit, to Ashford Grange's accounts, and the household, the staff, the steward, the rather formidable housekeeper who had worked for Caspian for 9 years and tolerated very little, responded to her with the immediate and unambiguous approval of people who recognize, without being told, someone who is genuinely capable and genuinely kind. She was not transformed by Barrowmere. She was not softened or polished or reinvented. She was exactly herself, with the particular relief of a person who has spent 3 years being compressed and has finally been given room. And Caspian, who had spent 41 years being the most feared man in 3 counties, and had found the designation accurate and not particularly troubling, found, to what I suspect was his considerable private surprise, that he was entirely content to be known in Emmeline's company as simply himself. A man with a code, a man who kept his word, a man who had on a November evening in a ballroom crossed a room. That was the story, that was all of it. I dined with them often in those first years at Barrowmere. I would sit across the table and watch them, Emmeline listening to something Caspian said with that quality of attention, and Caspian watching her listen with an expression that I had never in my life expected to see on his face, which was contentment, plain and total. And I would think about November, and the candle-lit room, and the woman at the edge of the floor who had been practicing stillness for 3 years, and the man who had walked across a crowded room to stand in front of her. He kept his word, Caspian Aldrich, He always had. But I think the best word he ever kept was the one he made on that terrace quietly to a woman in a blue-gray gown, the word that said, "You have been overlooked, and I see you, and I will not look away."